In 1837, Lancaster County witnessed a darkness that would forever stain its idyllic landscapes. Four sisters, bound by blood and secrets, each committed a crime that would shock the community to its core. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The stone house on Lancaster Pike stood proudly against the rolling Pennsylvania countryside, its weathered walls a testament to Irish immigrant determination. In the autumn of 1837, as golden leaves carpeted the fertile soil of Lancaster County, the Brennan family farmhouse became both sanctuary and prison for four sisters suddenly thrust into uncertainty. Patrick Brennan's funeral had barely concluded when the whispers began. The sisters, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah, gathered in their father's study as the family attorney explained their precarious position. Without male heirs, Pennsylvania law would eventually distribute their carefully cultivated 20 acres among distant male cousins they'd never met. 6 months, Bridget Brennan said, her voice steady despite the hollow ache in her chest. The eldest sister's sharp features hardened as she studied the property deed. At 32, she had expected to manage her own household by now, not become surrogate mother to her siblings. Catherine paced by the window, her quick mind already calculating possibilities. There must be some legal mechanism, the second sister insisted. At 29, her charm had attracted numerous suitors, all of whom she declined to remain with her family. Margaret sat quietly, her delicate hands folded in her lap. Though celebrated for her beauty throughout Lancaster County, the 26-year-old's innocent appearance masked a fierce loyalty to her sisters. Sarah, barely 23 and the most adaptable of the four, stoked the fire as evening shadows lengthened across the farmhouse kitchen. "They cannot simply take what father built," she whispered, their sweet exterior belying the determination beneath. That night, as autumn winds rattled the shutters of their stone home, the sisters gathered around the oak table their grandfather had brought from Ireland. By candlelight, they shared bread and whiskey, their faces illuminated in the flickering glow as they contemplated a future that threatened to scatter them like leaves. "Our strength has always been in our unity," Bridget declared, raising her glass. "I will not see this family torn apart by men's laws." Catherine nodded firmly. "Whatever must be done, we do it together." "Whatever it takes," Margaret echoed, her voice soft but resolute. Sarah completed the circle, her young face solemn. "We stay together." They clasped hands across the worn tabletop, their shadows merging on the wall behind them. The pact formed that night would bind the Brennan sisters in ways none could have imagined, a promise that would eventually scandalize Lancaster County and echo through Pennsylvania courtrooms for generations to come. None of them could have known that their simple vow of family loyalty would lead to 4 funerals, countless tears, and a legacy written in blood across the pages of American criminal history. Bridget Brennan stood at the window of the stone farmhouse, watching as Thomas Hennessy rode into view. Her marriage to the respected Irish Catholic attorney had been calculated, but not loveless. Thomas possessed both the legal knowledge and social standing the sisters desperately needed to secure their future. "He's back from Philadelphia," Catherine announced, joining her elder sister at the window. The second Brennan sister admired Thomas's straight posture as he dismounted from his horse with practiced ease. Within weeks of their wedding, Thomas had proven his worth. Using his legal expertise, he established an ironclad trust protecting the Brennan property from distant male relatives who circled like vultures since their father's passing. The sisters breathed easier knowing their home remained secure. Lancaster society embraced Thomas wholeheartedly. His charm and intelligence made him welcome at every gathering, while his Irish Catholic background resonated with the community's strong immigrant roots. Bridget watched with satisfaction as her husband became a respected pillar of local society, exactly as she had planned. "The trust documents are finalized," Thomas announced one evening over dinner with all 4 sisters. "Your inheritance is protected, ladies." Sarah, the youngest, raised her glass in celebration while Margaret's eyes shone with relief. Catherine squeezed Bridget's hand beneath the table. Their pact to stay together seemed assured. But as winter thawed into spring of 1838, Thomas began speaking of Philadelphia with increasing frequency. "The opportunities there are boundless," he would say, eyes bright with ambition. "We could establish ourselves properly in society." "We?" Bridget questioned one night as they prepared for bed. "Of course," Thomas replied, oblivious to her tension. "You and I would secure a townhouse first. Your sisters could visit until we arrange suitable situations for them." That night, Bridget lay awake long after Thomas fell asleep. His plans threatened everything the sisters had sworn to protect. Separation was unthinkable. The four Brennan women had vowed to remain together, whatever the cost. 3 days later, on a foggy March morning, Thomas's horse returned to the farmhouse alone, wild-eyed and lathered with sweat. The animal's empty saddle told a story before words were needed. Thomas Hennessy's body was discovered along Lancaster Pike, his neck broken from what appeared to be a tragic riding accident. The fog had been thick that morning, a treacherous condition for even the most experienced rider. At the inquest, the coroner noted how composed the widow appeared. "Shock," neighbors whispered sympathetically. Only Bridget's sisters recognized the steely resolve behind her black veil as she clutched the property documents her husband had secured. That evening, as Lancaster mourned the loss of a promising young attorney, 4 sisters gathered in the kitchen by candlelight, their pact reinforced by silence and shared glances. Thomas Hennessy's funeral procession wound through Lancaster's main street on a gray March morning in 1838. Black-clad mourners from Philadelphia to Harrisburg gathered at St. Mary's Church, their carriages forming a solemn line that stretched nearly half a mile. The attorney's sudden death had shocked the community, particularly given his rising prominence in legal circles. "Such promise cut short," whispered Judge Holloway to his wife as they watched the casket being carried into the church. "And only 32 years old." Bridget Brennan stood at the front pew, her black veil doing little to hide her composed expression. Her sisters, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah, flanked her like sentinels, their faces appropriately somber, but their eyes alert, scanning the crowd. Many expected the widow to collapse with grief, yet she remained eerily steady throughout the service, accepting condolences with a quiet dignity that some found admirable and others disturbing. "She's certainly handling it well," remarked Hamilton Crawford, the banker who had been handling the Brennan family's accounts. Catherine caught his eye and offered a subtle smile. 3 days after the burial, Bridget visited the county clerk's office. The eldest Brennan sister wasted no time securing the property deeds Thomas had placed in trust and updating the family will. Her efficiency raised eyebrows among the clerks, who exchanged glances as she meticulously reviewed each document. "Grief affects people differently," one clerk defended when questioned later. "Some throw themselves into practical matters." Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the county coroner who had examined Hennessy's body, sat alone at the Boar's Head Tavern that evening, nursing a glass of whiskey. The physician had noted peculiarities about the accident that troubled him. Thomas had been an accomplished rider since boyhood, according to his Philadelphia associates. The location of the fall, a relatively straight portion of Lancaster Pike, seemed an unlikely spot for an experienced horseman to lose control. "The horse wasn't spooked," he muttered to himself. "No signs of it bolting or rearing." Whitaker had also observed unusual bruising patterns inconsistent with a simple fall. When he'd mentioned these concerns to Sheriff Miller, the lawman had dismissed them. "You're looking for mysteries where there aren't any, Sam," the sheriff had said. "The man fell and broke his neck. Happens all the time." But as spring arrived in Lancaster County, whispers began circulating through parlors and after church services. The Brennan sisters, once viewed as vulnerable women bravely making their way after their father's death, were now subjects of sidelong glances and hushed conversations. "First their father, now the husband," murmured Mrs. Abernathy to her sewing circle. "Tragedy seems to follow those girls like a shadow." No one said it aloud, but the question hung in the air. Was it truly misfortune that haunted the stone house on Lancaster Pike, or something far more deliberate? With Thomas Hennessy's funeral barely 6 months past, Catherine Brennan set her sights on a new prospect. Hamilton Crawford wasn't just any banker. He controlled the largest financial institution in Lancaster County, with connections stretching to Philadelphia and beyond. His silver-streaked hair and immaculate waistcoats marked him as a man of substance, precisely what the sisters needed. Catherine employed her natural charm with calculated precision. During Sunday services at St. Mary's, she positioned herself where Crawford would notice her devotional posture. At community gatherings, her witty observations and intelligent questions about banking matters drew him closer. Within 3 months, he was escorting her on afternoon rides in his polished carriage. "Mr. Crawford has asked to court me properly," Catherine announced one evening as her sisters gathered around the kitchen table. Bridget nodded approvingly, while Sarah clapped with seemingly innocent delight. "His fortune would secure us for generations," Bridget observed, her widow's cap still framing her composed face. "And his influence could protect our arrangements." The banker proposed by autumn, and by winter, he had moved his personal effects into the stone farmhouse. But Crawford's initial enchantment with Catherine began to fade as peculiarities emerged. He noticed how the sisters refused separate living quarters despite his offers to build Catherine her own home in town. Their insistence on maintaining joint accounts raised his professional suspicions. Most troubling were the late-night conversations he overheard between the women, abruptly silenced when he entered a room. Once, he discovered Bridget reviewing his financial ledgers, claiming interest in how widows might protect their assets. Crawford began keeping a leather-bound journal, recording his observations in a meticulous banker's hand. The sisters maintain an unusual devotion that borders on conspiracy, he wrote one February evening. Catherine speaks of them as if they share one mind, one purpose. When he questioned why Sarah was studying medicinal herbs with such intensity, the youngest sister smiled sweetly and claimed interest in healing. Yet he found her notes on foxglove dosages disturbing. "I fear I have married into something I do not fully comprehend," became his final journal entry. "Tomorrow I shall visit my attorney to discuss certain precautions." The next morning, Crawford mentioned a solitary walk to clear his thoughts. Catherine kissed him goodbye with particular tenderness, while Margaret watched from the parlor window, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. No one questioned why the banker would venture near Mill Creek in February's bitter cold. By nightfall, when he hadn't returned, the sisters organized a search party that found exactly what they expected beneath the frozen surface. The morning of February 9th, 1839, dawned with a bitter chill that had gripped Lancaster for weeks. Jacob Milner, a local fisherman, made the grim discovery while checking his ice fishing holes on Mill Creek. There, beneath 6 inches of crystalline ice, lay the motionless form of Hamilton Crawford, his eyes open in a final frozen stare. Word spread quickly through town. Catherine Brennan received the news with a composure that struck the messenger as oddly controlled. She dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, while Bridget stood beside her, a hand firmly on her sister's shoulder. "My husband was an excellent swimmer," Catherine explained to Sheriff Donovan. "He must have slipped on the bank and struck his head before falling in." Her voice never wavered as she recounted how Hamilton had mentioned inspecting the creek's water level for potential spring flooding. The banker's funeral drew half of Lancaster County. Business associates from Philadelphia traveled despite treacherous roads, testifying to Crawford's reputation. While Catherine accepted condolences with downcast eyes, Margaret and Sarah flanked her protectively, their faces appropriately somber. Bridget managed the arrangements with the same efficiency she'd shown after her own husband's death. The creek where Hamilton was found measured barely 4 feet deep, strange waters for an experienced swimmer to drown in. When Crawford's estate entered probate, his clerk discovered a leather-bound journal hidden behind a loose brick in his office wall. The final entries revealed a man increasingly uneasy in his own home. Catherine speaks often with her sisters late into the night, read one passage. When I enter a room, their conversation shifts unnaturally. Yesterday, I found Sarah studying my banking ledgers with unusual interest. The most disturbing entry came just 3 days before his death. I fear Catherine's gentle hands may not be as innocent as they appear. She suggested we walk by Mill Creek tomorrow to discuss summer plans. I've arranged for Murphy to follow discreetly. Judge Cornelius Whitman, reviewing these materials privately, felt a chill unrelated to the February cold. The pattern emerging around the Brennan sisters could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. 2 husbands, 2 deaths, 2 inheritances secured. That evening, Whitman shared his concerns with Margaret, studying her face carefully for reaction. Her momentary hesitation told him everything he needed to know. Margaret Brennan, with her delicate features and soft-spoken manner, had always been considered the gentlest of the sisters. Her marriage to Cornelius Whitman in the spring of 1840 was celebrated throughout Lancaster County as a perfect union. The county circuit judge was not only respected for his fair rulings, but also admired for his handsome appearance and impeccable manners. "You've made a fine match," Bridget told her sister on the wedding day, her eyes calculating as she watched the judge speaking with prominent townspeople. "His position will secure our future quite nicely." The wedding reception at the Stone farmhouse on Lancaster Pike showcased the Brennan sisters' hospitality. Catherine charmed the guests, while Sarah ensured everyone's glasses remained full. Only Margaret seemed distracted, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Judge Whitman moved into the farmhouse the following week. At first, he found the sisters' close bond endearing, 4 women who had weathered hardship together and emerged stronger. But as summer faded into autumn, he began noticing peculiarities. The hushed conversations that abruptly ceased when he entered a room. The strange looks exchanged between Bridget and Catherine when property matters were discussed. The way Sarah would disappear into the woods, returning with bundles of plants she refused to identify. One night, unable to sleep, Cornelius descended the creaking staircase for a glass of water. Voices drifted from the kitchen, Bridget's authoritative tone cutting through the darkness. "Hamilton's property transfer is nearly complete," she was saying. "Margaret's husband will be even more useful. The judge can ensure no questions are raised about any of it. And if he becomes difficult," Sarah's voice was barely audible, "then we'll handle him as we did the others," Catherine replied matter-of-factly. The judge retreated silently to his study, where he began keeping a leather-bound journal hidden behind a loose panel in the bookcase. Each night, he documented his observations, building a case against his new family. His legal mind recognized the pattern forming, connecting the deaths of Thomas Hennessy and Hamilton Crawford to his new wife and her sisters. Margaret noticed the change in her husband. His once warm eyes now watched her with calculation. He began making unexpected visits to his courthouse office at night, claiming urgent cases demanded his attention. She reported these developments to Bridget, who merely nodded. "Keep him close," the eldest sister advised. "We need his signature on those final documents before winter." Judge Whitman continued his secret investigation, torn between duty to the law and growing fear for his own safety. Each night, he added to his hidden journal, never suspecting that Margaret had already discovered its location. Autumn leaves scattered across the Brennan property as Cornelius Whitman paced the study, gathering courage for the confrontation he'd been rehearsing for weeks. The oil lamp cast long shadows as Margaret Brennan entered. her normally composed features tightening when she noticed the papers spread across his desk. "You've been investigating my family," she said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact." Cornelius nodded, his judicial demeanor firmly in place. 3 men dead in 3 years, all married to Brennan sisters. I'm not a fool, Margaret. The silence between them stretched until Margaret sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping in what appeared to be defeat. What happened next stunned him to his core. "Bridget loosened Thomas's saddle strap," she whispered, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. She knew exactly where he would ride that morning and exactly how steep that hill was. The judge stared at his wife, disbelief warring with a terrible certainty. "And Crawford?" "Catherine," Margaret continued, "suggested they go ice fishing. She'd been weakening the ice for days. When Hamilton fell through, she watched him struggle before walking away." Cornelius gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. "And your youngest sister?" "Sarah has become quite the botanist," Margaret replied with a bitter smile. "Foxglove, belladonna, herbs that mimic heart failure. She's been testing them on strays that wander onto our property." The judge watched his wife carefully, noting how her hands remained steady, how her eyes never wavered. Was this genuine remorse, or something more calculated? Margaret reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "I've documented everything," she said, placing it between them. "Dates, methods, conversations. I couldn't live with it anymore." Cornelius didn't immediately reach for the book. "Why tell me this now? You must know what this means." "Because you're next," she replied simply. "Bridget has decided your questions have become dangerous. Sarah has already prepared something for you." The journal sat between them like a loaded weapon. Cornelius finally took it, thumbing through pages filled with Margaret's neat handwriting, detailed accounts of murders methodically planned and executed. "Is this a confession?" he asked carefully, "or are you luring me into their next trap?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears that seemed genuine. "I took vows to you in church, Cornelius, but I made promises to my sisters long before that. I'm caught between 2 loyalties, and I don't know which will destroy me first." The judge closed the journal, his mind racing through legal precedents, escape routes, and the terrible possibility that his wife's confession was itself another deadly step in the sisters' conspiracy. Sarah Brennan's hands moved with practiced precision as she crushed dried foxglove leaves in her mother's old mortar. The youngest of the 4 sisters had taken to her new role with unexpected aptitude. While her siblings managed the public face of their scheme, Sarah had discovered her own particular talent. "Just a pinch more," she whispered to herself, measuring the powdered plant against the morning light streaming through the farmhouse window. Unlike her sisters, Sarah preferred working in daylight. Poison was too delicate a science for candlelight. Outside, a stray cat convulsed in the barn, its heart racing from yesterday's experimental dose. Sarah had meticulously recorded its symptoms in a leather-bound journal hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. The animal's reaction suggested she needed to reduce the concentration for a man of Judge Whitman's size and constitution. Belladonna proved even more promising than foxglove. The clear extract she'd distilled mimicked the symptoms of natural heart failure so perfectly that even Lancaster's most suspicious physician would find no cause for alarm. Sarah had tested various preparations on rabbits and squirrels, documenting how long each took to succumb and which showed the fewest external signs. "What are you doing?" Margaret's voice startled her from the doorway. Sarah quickly covered her work with a kitchen cloth. "Just preparing some medicinal teas," she replied, her sweet smile betraying nothing of her true purpose. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes lingering on the vial of clear liquid. "For Cornelius? He's been complaining of fatigue," Sarah said softly. "This will help him sleep." That night, while Bridget and Catherine discussed land boundaries with a neighboring farmer, Margaret slipped into Sarah's room. Her hands trembled as she located the hidden floorboard and extracted both the vial and Sarah's detailed notes. The methodical documentation chilled her. Pages of observations on dying animals, calculations of body weight to dosage ratios, and a timeline for Judge Whitman's natural demise. By morning, Margaret had smuggled the evidence to her husband. "This was meant for your evening tea," she whispered, placing the vial in Cornelius Whitman's palm. "Sarah has been perfecting this for weeks." The judge examined the innocent-looking liquid. Would it have been detected? No, Margaret admitted. She's become quite skilled. The foxglove slows the heart until it stops, while the belladonna ensures no suspicious marks remain. Whitman carefully sealed the vial in his handkerchief. "And your sisters?" "They know nothing of my betrayal," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. "But we must leave soon. Once they discover I've warned you, I'll be next." The pact that had bound the Brennan sisters was unraveling, thread by treacherous thread, as invisible as the poison Sarah had so carefully crafted. By the spring of 1840, whispers of the Brennan sisters' possible involvement in the deaths of two prominent men had traveled beyond Lancaster County. Merchants returning from Philadelphia brought tales of suspicion that followed the family name, and local churchgoers exchanged glances whenever the widowed sisters attended Sunday service. Daniel Murphy, a former Pinkerton agent with a reputation for discretion, arrived in Lancaster claiming to represent concerned parties from Philadelphia. The investigator took rooms at the White Swan Inn, his presence unremarkable among the travelers passing through. With his unassuming manner and ready smile, Murphy began collecting information, speaking with shopkeepers and tavern owners who had served the deceased men. Judge Cornelius Whitman noticed the stranger's inquiries and began his own quiet surveillance. One evening, after returning from court, he confronted Margaret with his concerns about the investigator. "There's a man asking questions about your sister's husbands," he told her, watching her face carefully for signs of alarm. To his astonishment, Margaret smiled. "Daniel Murphy. Bridget hired him 3 months ago." "Your sister hired an investigator?" Whitman asked, struggling to make sense of this revelation. Margaret poured tea as she explained. "Bridget pays him handsomely to monitor anyone who questions our family's tragedies. Every conversation you've had in town about Thomas or Hamilton has been reported back to us." The judge felt a chill run through him. The sisters weren't just protecting themselves. They were actively tracking potential threats. His own cautious inquiries, his private conversations with the county clerk about the suspicious timing of Crawford's death. Murphy had documented it all. "He follows you sometimes," Margaret continued, her voice unnervingly calm. "Last Tuesday, when you visited the records office, he watched from the haberdashery across the street." Whitman recalled the ordinary-looking man examining hats that day. He'd thought nothing of it. "Every letter you've sent to Philadelphia has been noted," she added. "Bridget knows about your correspondence with Hamilton's former banking associates." The realization struck him with terrible clarity. His investigation wasn't secret at all. Every step he'd taken to uncover the truth had been reported directly to the women he suspected of murder. The judge looked at his wife, this woman he'd married, shared a bed with, confided in, and wondered if his own name was already being added to the sisters' list of inconvenient men. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his hand trembling slightly as he set down his teacup. Margaret's eyes met his. "Because you need to understand who you're dealing with." The November air bit with unusual sharpness as Cornelius Whitman and Margaret Brennan huddled near the bedroom window, whispering their escape plans. They would leave before dawn, taking only what they could carry in a single satchel. The circuit judge had arranged for a friend's wagon to meet them at the crossroads, far from prying eyes. "We'll be in Philadelphia by nightfall," Cornelius assured her, squeezing her trembling hand. "From there, west to Ohio, where no one knows the Brennan name." Margaret nodded, her face pale in the candlelight. The weight of betraying her sisters pressed upon her shoulders, yet the alternative, remaining entangled in their deadly web, had become unbearable. Their whispers were interrupted by Sarah, who appeared at the doorway with her characteristic silent footfall. "Bridget wants everyone in the kitchen," she announced, her sweet voice belying the coldness in her eyes. Before they could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night. Peering through frost-edged glass, Cornelia spotted a line of torches snaking up the Lancaster Pike toward the farmhouse. "Federal marshals," he breathed, recognizing the formation. At least a dozen. Bridget Brennan appeared behind them, her face hardening as she assessed the approaching riders. "Murphy," she spat. "That weasel sold us out." Catherine rushed into the room, clutching papers. "Burn everything," she ordered, already feeding documents to the fireplace. The journals, the letters, all of it. The eldest sister turned to Margaret with accusing eyes. "Did you do this?" "It wasn't her," Cornelius interjected, positioning himself between the sisters. "Daniel Murphy has betrayed you. He's been collecting evidence for weeks, trading your secrets for immunity and reward money." Sarah laughed bitterly. "The man you hired to protect us, Bridget. Your perfect plan." Outside, the federal marshals surrounded the stone farmhouse, torchlight casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Their commander's voice carried through the night air. "Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah Brennan, by the authority of the United States government, you are ordered to surrender yourselves." The sisters exchanged glances, a silent communication honed through years of shared secrets. In that moment, their carefully constructed world began to fracture along fault lines of fear and self-preservation. "There's still the cellar passage," Catherine whispered desperately. "We could—" "It's over," Margaret interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. "They know everything." As the marshal's pounding shook the heavy oak door, Bridget straightened her spine and smoothed her skirts with dignity. "Remember our pact," she reminded her sisters, even as their unity crumbled around them. "Whatever happens, we stay together." The door splintered open, and the night flooded in. The night air crackled with tension as federal marshals surrounded the Brennan farmhouse. Their torches cast eerie shadows against the stone walls that had witnessed 3 years of calculated deception. With a thunderous crash, the front door splintered open, and 6 armed men stormed into the sisters' sanctuary. Bridget Brennan stood defiantly in the parlor, her composure unbroken, even as iron manacles closed around her wrists. Catherine attempted to flee through the kitchen, but was quickly apprehended, her usual charm replaced by cold fury. Sarah, caught mixing powders in her bedroom, barely had time to conceal a small vial before being dragged downstairs to join her sisters. "This is outrageous," Bridget declared, addressing the lead marshal with surprising authority despite her restraints. "Judge Whitman has fabricated these accusations out of spite for my sister's rejection of his advances." Catherine nodded emphatically. "Margaret suffers from delusions. Ask anyone in Lancaster about her episodes of hysteria." The eldest sister's eyes narrowed as she spotted Cornelius Whitman standing in the doorway, Margaret trembling beside him. "You've turned my own sister against us," she hissed. The judge stepped forward, holding a leather-bound journal. "This contains everything, written in Margaret's hand. Dates, methods, conversations, your entire conspiracy documented." Sarah, usually the most controlled, suddenly lost her composure. "Murphy promised he wouldn't," she began, then fell silent, realizing her mistake too late. The marshal raised an eyebrow. "So you admit knowing Daniel Murphy was gathering evidence?" "We hired him to investigate threats against our family," Bridget countered smoothly. "He's clearly been paid to fabricate testimony." As the sisters were led to waiting wagons outside, neighbors gathered at a distance, their faces illuminated by lantern light. Women who had shared tea with the Brennans now crossed themselves in fear. Men who had tipped their hats in respect now stared in morbid fascination. Even in custody, Bridget maintained her commanding presence. "This won't stand," she informed the marshal escorting her. We have friends in Harrisburg and Philadelphia who understand our situation. Powerful men who recognize the injustice of property laws. The marshal merely tightened her restraints. "Save it for the judge, Miss Brennan." As the wagon carrying the three sisters pulled away, Margaret collapsed against Whitman's shoulder. "They'll never forgive me," she whispered. "Forgiveness isn't what concerns me," the judge replied, watching the procession disappear into the darkness. "It's whether their connections are as powerful as Bridget claims." Behind them, the Brennan farmhouse stood silent, its windows dark for the first time in generations, a monument to ambition, sisterhood, and betrayal that would soon become the most infamous property in all of Pennsylvania. "Murderous sisters shock nation," screamed the bold headlines of the Philadelphia Inquirer on a crisp December morning in 1840. The Lancaster Herald followed with "Brennan Witches, a conspiracy of death." Within 48 hours, newspapers as far as Boston and Richmond carried the sensational story of the four sisters who had orchestrated a series of calculated murders to preserve their inheritance. The arrest of Bridget, Catherine, and Sarah Brennan transformed Lancaster County overnight. Neighbors who had attended their husbands' funerals now locked their doors at the mention of the Brennan name. The same community that had once pitied them as vulnerable women left to fend for themselves now recoiled in horror at the emerging details. "They seemed so normal," remarked Elizabeth Donovan, who had shared pews with the sisters at St. Mary's Church. "To think they broke bread with us while plotting such wickedness." The Philadelphia Inquirer published a special edition detailing each death: Thomas Hennessy's fatal riding accident, Hamilton Crawford's mysterious drowning, and the suspected poisoning plot against Judge Whitman. Illustrations depicted the stone farmhouse as a sinister fortress where the sisters had formed their deadly pact. Margaret Brennan's testimony became the most sought-after information in the nation. Excerpts from her journal, carefully leaked by prosecutors, revealed chilling details of late-night conversations where her sisters had planned their husbands' demises. The youngest sister's experiments with foxglove and belladonna particularly horrified readers. "The most dangerous aspect," wrote the editor of the Lancaster Herald, "is that these women appeared to be pillars of respectability. If such evil can hide behind lace curtains and Sunday bonnets, who among us is truly safe?" Street vendors sold penny pamphlets with titles like "The Brennan Sisterhood," "Satan's Brides," and "Beware the Widow's Smile." Artists created dramatic engravings of the sisters standing over their husbands' graves, which were reproduced in newspapers across the country. Daniel Murphy, the investigator whose betrayal had led to the arrests, gave exclusive interviews for substantial sums. "They were calculating in every aspect," he told the New York Tribune. Bridget Brennan could discuss murder with the same calm she'd used to plan Sunday dinner. As the sisters awaited trial in separate cells, the public's fascination only intensified. Crowds gathered outside the jail, hoping for a glimpse of the women who had defied both law and nature. Letters poured in from across the country, some condemning them as monsters, others expressing a disturbing admiration for their determination. The Brennan case had transcended mere crime to become a national sensation, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about women, property, and the lengths to which desperation might drive the seemingly virtuous. The Philadelphia courthouse stood as a monument to justice, its marble columns dwarfing the three Brennan sisters as they entered in chains. The year 1841 marked what newspapers across the nation had already dubbed the trial of the century. Spectators from as far as Baltimore and New York had traveled for days, sleeping in carriages and boarding houses just to witness the proceedings. Bridget Brennan maintained her composure, her sharp eyes scanning the crowded gallery. Catherine sat beside her, occasionally whispering strategic observations to their defense attorney. Sarah, the youngest, appeared almost childlike in her demeanor, though the jury seemed unmoved by her innocent facade. Prosecutor William Harrington painted a damning portrait of calculated murder. These women, he proclaimed, gesturing dramatically toward the defendants, conspired not out of necessity, but greed. They viewed their husbands as mere stepping stones to secure their inheritance. The defense countered with passionate arguments about the injustice of inheritance laws. What choice did these women have? Their attorney challenged. The law would strip them of everything their father built, everything they helped create with their own hands. Several female spectators nodded in silent agreement. The courthouse fell to a hush when Margaret Brennan took the stand. Dressed in modest gray, she avoided her sister's gaze as she swore her oath. Bridget's face hardened into stone as her sister began to speak. "It was Bridget who planned it all," Margaret testified, her voice barely audible at first. "She said we needed to be clever about securing our future." The eldest sister's expression remained unchanged, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped the table before her. Margaret described in chilling detail how each husband had been selected for his usefulness. Thomas Hennessy's legal knowledge, Hamilton Crawford's banking connections, my husband's position as judge, all were chosen deliberately. When questioned about Sarah's role, Margaret revealed how the youngest had studied botanical texts, testing various concoctions on small animals before perfecting her deadly mixtures. Several jurors visibly recoiled. The most damning evidence came when Hamilton Crawford's journal was read aloud. His suspicions now validated beyond the grave. The banker had documented strange conversations, mysterious absences, and his growing fear that his marriage was merely a transaction. As the trial entered its second week, public opinion crystallized. Some viewed the sisters as monsters. Others saw desperate women fighting an unjust system. Editorials debated whether the true criminal was the law itself, forcing women to such extremes. By the final day, even the most sympathetic observers couldn't deny the weight of evidence. Margaret's testimony, the journals, and the unmistakable pattern of convenient deaths had sealed the sisters' fate. The jury needed just 4 hours to reach their verdict. The Brennan case exploded beyond the boundaries of Lancaster County, igniting fierce debate across American society. Newspapers from Boston to Richmond carried daily updates, with the Philadelphia Inquirer selling out 3 consecutive editions featuring courtroom illustrations of the sisters. Pamphlets with titles like The Venomous Widows and Sisters in Sin circulated through taverns and parlors alike. Reverend Thomas Whitfield of Boston's Third Presbyterian Church thundered from his pulpit. These women had perverted God's natural order, using cunning where the Lord intended submission. His sermon, later published and distributed to 23 states, framed the Brennan sisters as emblematic of moral decay, threatening American values. Yet in the same week, Elizabeth Cady, a young activist from New York, published a controversial editorial arguing that Bridget Brennan and her sisters were merely the inevitable product of laws that render women property rather than persons. Her perspective gained traction among nascent women's rights advocates who pointed to the case as evidence that inheritance laws needed urgent reform. In Philadelphia's town hall, a heated debate drew hundreds. Would these murders have occurred if women could inherit their father's land outright? Asked one speaker, while another countered that no unjust law justifies the taking of innocent lives. The division cut across unexpected lines. Some conservative landowners quietly sympathized with the sisters' plight, recognizing how their own daughters might face similar circumstances. Meanwhile, certain religious women condemned the sisters most harshly, seeing their actions as a betrayal of feminine virtue. Cornelius Whitman's role provoked particular controversy. "A judge who sweeps with criminals cannot judge criminals," wrote the Baltimore Sun, while others viewed him as Margaret's unwitting victim until her confession saved him. In taverns across Pennsylvania, men debated whether Daniel Murphy was a hero for exposing the plot or a traitor who betrayed his employers for financial gain. The investigator himself disappeared from public view, reportedly taking his reward money to start a new life in Chicago. Even President Van Buren was asked his opinion during a public appearance, though he diplomatically declined to comment on an ongoing legal matter. The case became a litmus test for one's views on women's rights, property law, and the very nature of justice. As the trial progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, Americans found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. Was the true crime committed by the sisters, or by a system that left them no legitimate path to security? The nation, much like the jury that would soon decide the Brennan sisters' fate, remained deeply divided. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Elias Thornton adjusted his spectacles on March 1, 1841. The Philadelphia courthouse, packed beyond capacity, held its collective breath. Bridget Brennan stood tall between her sisters, her face a mask of defiance, even as the verdict echoed through the chamber. Guilty on all counts of conspiracy and homicide in the first degree. Catherine's composure cracked only slightly, a single tear tracking down her cheek as she gripped the wooden railing before her. Sarah, the youngest, stared vacantly ahead, her sweet exterior now hollow as the gravity of their situation settled upon her shoulders. The court has never witnessed such calculated malice, Judge Thornton declared, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room. 3 men of standing, deliberately selected and systematically eliminated to preserve your inheritance and maintain your unnatural pact. The prosecution's evidence had been damning. Margaret Brennan's detailed journal, Hamilton Crawford's private records, documenting his growing fears, and the vials of poison found hidden beneath the floorboards of the stone farmhouse. Most devastating was Margaret's testimony against her own blood, delivered with trembling voice but unwavering resolve. By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the judge continued, I hereby sentence Bridget, Catherine, and Sarah Brennan to death by hanging. Gasps rippled through the crowd. While men had faced the gallows for lesser crimes, the execution of 3 women, sisters no less, was unprecedented. Several ladies in attendance fainted, requiring assistance from court officers. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Her cooperation with authorities had earned her immunity, a new identity, and safe passage out of Pennsylvania. Rumors suggested she would travel west with Cornelius Whitman, though others whispered that the judge had abandoned her after securing his own freedom. Outside the courthouse, newspaper boys hawked special editions detailing the Brennan sisters' reign of terror. Pamphlets circulated debating whether their crimes reflected inherent female wickedness or were the desperate acts of women trapped by unjust inheritance laws. Lancaster County began preparations for what would become the most notorious execution in its history. Carpenters constructed a special gallows large enough to accommodate 3 women simultaneously. Ministers visited the condemned sisters, finding Bridget resolute, Catherine repentant, and Sarah withdrawn into herself. As they were led back to their cells, Bridget turned to the crowd and spoke her final public words. We fought for what was rightfully ours. History will judge who the true criminals were. The bailiff quickly silenced her, but her words lingered in the minds of many as Lancaster steeled itself for the grim spectacle to come. March 15, 1841, dawned gray and solemn over Lancaster County. Precisely 3 years had passed since Thomas Hennessy's body was discovered on that foggy road, a symmetry not lost on the townsfolk who gathered outside the Lancaster jail. The execution of Bridget Catherine and Sarah Brennan had drawn hundreds from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, some traveling for days by carriage and horseback to witness this unprecedented event. The sisters emerged from the jailhouse dressed in identical black dresses, their hands bound before them. Bridget Brennan, ever the leader, walked with her head high, her gaze sweeping across the crowd with defiance. Catherine followed, her once charming smile now a tight line across her pale face. Sarah, the youngest, trembled visibly but maintained the composure that had served her so well during their calculated crimes. Sheriff William Dawson read the official sentence as the sisters were positioned beneath the wooden gallows. The structure, hastily reinforced for the occasion, creaked in the morning breeze. No women had ever been executed for such calculated murders in Pennsylvania's history, and the crowd stood in uncomfortable silence. Many wrestling with conflicted emotions, several prominent Lancaster citizens had petitioned for clemency, arguing that the inheritance laws had driven the sisters to desperate measures. These appeals had been firmly rejected by the governor, who declared that murder, regardless of motive or gender of the perpetrator, must face the ultimate consequence. A priest offered final prayers, which Bridget and Catherine accepted with closed eyes. Sarah, however, used her final moments to scan the crowd, perhaps searching for a glimpse of Margaret, though her sister was long gone, having secured her freedom through betrayal. When asked for final words, Bridget spoke for all three. "We chose our family over your laws. History will judge who was truly criminal." Her voice carried across the hushed gathering, causing several women to lower their eyes. At precisely 9 o'clock, the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoors dropped open with a thunderous crack that echoed through the square. The crowd collectively gasped, many turning away from the sight of three women suspended in the morning air. Even hardened farmers and veteran lawmen found themselves disturbed by the spectacle. The bodies swayed gently for 20 minutes before the county physician confirmed their deaths. The Brennan sisters were then cut down and placed in plain pine coffins, denied burial in consecrated ground. They were interred in unmarked graves on unclaimed land outside town, their final resting place as anonymous as the future they had so desperately tried to secure. As the crowd dispersed, conversations turned to the absent Margaret and Judge Whitman, whose disappearance had become as legendary as the sisters' crimes. Many wondered if justice had truly been served, or if the hangman's rope had simply tightened society's existing noose around women's independence. The Brennan farmhouse, once the pride of Lancaster County, stood empty for months after the execution. Locals avoided the property, whispering that the spirits of Thomas Hennessy, Hamilton Crawford, and other victims lingered among the stone walls. By summer of 1841, creditors and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania seized the estate to settle mounting debts from legal proceedings. On a sweltering August day, the auction drew a modest crowd of onlookers but few serious bidders. Most families wanted nothing to do with land tainted by such infamous crimes. Eventually, the property sold for less than half its value to Ezekiel Thornton, a land speculator from Philadelphia who cared nothing for local superstitions. "This soil has no memory," Thornton told the Lancaster Intelligencer, "only opportunity." The stone house where the sisters had made their deadly pact remained vacant for 3 more years. Vandals broke windows and carved messages into doorframes. Children dared each other to spend nights inside, claiming to hear women's whispers in empty rooms. By 1845, Thornton tired of the property's reputation and ordered the house demolished, stone by stone. The once unified Brennan estate was divided into 5 smaller parcels and sold to families moving west from New York and New Jersey, newcomers unfamiliar with the land's dark history. Within a decade, the rolling farmland that had inspired such desperate measures bore no visible trace of the Brennan sisters. Meanwhile, Margaret Brennan and Cornelius Whitman disappeared from official records after the trial. The judge, whose testimony had helped convict her sisters, honored his promise to Margaret despite her betrayal. Using connections in the federal government, Whitman secured new identities for them both. Rumors placed the couple in Missouri Territory by 1843. A schoolteacher named Elizabeth Wilson and her husband James, who worked as a territorial administrator, matched their descriptions. Several Lancaster residents traveling west claimed to recognize Margaret despite her changed appearance and name, though none confronted her directly. The last credible sighting came from a former Lancaster merchant who reported seeing the couple in St. Louis in 1852. By then, they had 2 children who knew nothing of their parents' past. The merchant chose silence, later explaining, "The terror in her eyes when she saw me. I couldn't bring myself to destroy another family." Court records in Philadelphia contain a sealed letter from 1863, postmarked from San Francisco, requesting confirmation that the Brennan case remained closed. The signature was illegible, but archivists believe it came from either Margaret or the judge, seeking final assurance their secret would remain buried, much like the foundation stones of the farmhouse that once stood on Lancaster Pike. For years after the execution, Lancaster County remained in a state of collective shock. The scandal of the Brennan sisters had torn through the community like wildfire, leaving behind a landscape of suspicion and unease that refused to fade. In church pews and market squares, conversations would fall to hushed whispers whenever the sisters' names were mentioned. Reverend Thomas Whitley of Lancaster First Presbyterian addressed the lingering trauma directly in his Sunday sermons. "Evil wears many faces," he cautioned his congregation, "sometimes hidden behind the most respectable countenances in our very midst." His warnings resonated with parishioners who had once broken bread with Bridget, Catherine, and Sarah at community gatherings. The legacy manifested in practical ways as well. Local attorneys reported an unprecedented surge in families reviewing their inheritance arrangements. Men with substantial property holdings suddenly became concerned about the security of their wills, while wives found themselves subjected to subtle scrutiny. The phrase "pulling a Brennan" entered the local vernacular as shorthand for any woman suspected of harboring ulterior motives. Women who lived independently or showed too much interest in legal matters faced particular suspicion. When Elizabeth Thornton, a widow who managed her late husband's mercantile business, attended a town council meeting regarding property taxes, several men exchanged knowing glances. The mere act of a woman asserting herself in financial matters had become cause for alarm. The farmhouse where the sisters had plotted their crimes remained vacant for nearly a decade. Though eventually purchased and demolished, locals claimed the new structures built on that land never prospered. Farmers reported that crops planted there yielded less than neighboring fields, and livestock grew inexplicably nervous when grazing that soil. Perhaps most telling was how the case affected Lancaster's courtship patterns. Young women complained that potential suitors now insisted on meeting their entire families before proceeding with marriage arrangements. Some men went so far as to request written character references before proposing. The county courthouse maintained a special section in its archives dedicated to the case, where curious citizens and law students from Philadelphia occasionally came to review the transcripts. The court clerk noted that interest in the documents never waned, even decades later. Lancaster had weathered many storms throughout its history: wars, economic hardships, and natural disasters. But the shadow cast by 4 sisters who had challenged the natural order of society proved the most enduring legacy of all. In 1872, nearly 3 decades after the Brennan sisters met their fate, the Baltimore Herald published a peculiar report. A wealthy tobacco merchant named Elias Thornton had been found dead at the bottom of his cellar stairs, the 3rd prominent Maryland businessman to die in suspicious circumstances that year. All 3 men had recently married women who subsequently inherited their estates. Detective Francis Holloway, who had studied the infamous Brennan case during his training, noticed unsettling similarities. "These deaths bear the hallmark of calculation, not chance," he wrote in his case notes. The widows, like Bridget Brennan before them, displayed remarkable composure at their husbands' funerals and demonstrated unusual knowledge of inheritance law. By 1875, similar patterns emerged in Richmond and Wilmington. The Delaware Gazette reported 5 cases where wealthy men died shortly after updating their wills. In each instance, their widows had been seen carrying pamphlets about the Brennan sisters, crude publications that had circulated throughout the Mid-Atlantic since the original trial. The Brennan method, as it became known in hushed conversations among law enforcement, seemed to have inspired a generation of women trapped in loveless marriages or desperate financial situations. These women studied the sisters' mistakes rather than their methods, leaving no journals, forming no suspicious sisterhoods, and spacing their crimes years apart. In Virginia, 3 cousins, all married to plantation owners, were eventually convicted of poisoning their husbands after investigators found a hidden collection of newspaper clippings about the Lancaster case. The women had carefully improved upon Sarah Brennan's techniques, using botanical toxins that left no trace in the body. Most disturbing was the case of Elizabeth Harmon in Annapolis, who had corresponded with Margaret Brennan under her new identity. Letters discovered after Elizabeth's arrest revealed that Margaret, despite her testimony against her sisters, had provided detailed advice on how to stage accidents that would appear natural. The Brennan sisters may have been hanged, wrote Judge William Patterson in his 1879 address to the Maryland Criminal Justice Association. But their influence lives on in a shadow network of women who have learned that murder, properly executed, can be disguised as misfortune. Law enforcement across the region began special training to recognize these methodical killings. Yet, for every case discovered, authorities suspected dozens more remained perfect crimes, their perpetrators having learned from the Brennans' legacy not just how to kill, but how to escape detection altogether. In the archives of Lancaster County Historical Society, a peculiar pattern emerges for those who know where to look. Property records from the late 19th century reveal a curious concentration of widows inheriting substantial estates, women whose husbands died under circumstances eerily reminiscent of the Brennan sisters' methods. County historian Martha Donovan has spent 3 decades tracing these shadows. "I found a woman in 1876 who lost 3 husbands in 5 years, she explains. Each death mimicked natural causes: a riding accident, a drowning, a sudden heart failure. The parallels to the Brennan cases are unmistakable. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is their connection to Margaret Brennan and Cornelius Whitman. Census records from Missouri show a couple matching their descriptions, settling there under the name Mitchell in 1843. They had 2 daughters who eventually returned east, one to Maryland, one to southern Pennsylvania. The daughters would have known their mother's story, Donovan theorizes. Perhaps Margaret's confession wasn't truly repentance, but preservation of knowledge, ensuring the family method survived. The legacy continues in whispered stories. Local families still warn young men about certain Lancaster surnames, though these names change with each generation. Property transfers show unusual patterns, female-owned farms expanding through strategic marriages followed by convenient widowhoods. Even today, Lancaster County experiences an above-average rate of unexplained domestic accidents. Insurance investigators occasionally note the statistical anomaly, but find nothing concrete to pursue. The methods, like the Brennan sisters themselves, have evolved with the times. The old stone foundation of the Brennan farmhouse remains visible in certain seasons when the corn grows low. Local farmers avoid the spot, claiming the ground there never yields proper crops. Children dare each other to stand on the foundation at midnight, whispering the names of the 4 sisters. What began as a desperate pact between 4 women has transformed into something more insidious, a shadow inheritance passed through generations. The sisters' legacy lives not in monuments or marked graves, but in techniques of survival and quiet resistance against laws designed to disinherit women. Lancaster County's rolling hills and neat farms conceal centuries of secrets. Behind lace curtains and Sunday best, the boundary between victim and perpetrator, justice and vengeance, remains as blurred as it was in 1837. The most chilling aspect of the Brennan sisters' story may be that it never truly ended. It merely changed form, adapting like Sarah's poisons, waiting patiently at the breakfast table.